God, thank you for your word. Thank you for the family that we have together here in Christ. Thank you for faith and hope and love. Thank you for sending your son to die for us. And God, we just ask that you'll keep us safe and keep us rooted firmly in your spirit and in your embrace. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right. So if y'all could, hey, Wes or Bruce, would one of y'all put me, click my slideshow, kind of get me started here? Okay. So this is the class that I don't know if I've been waiting to teach this one or not. I thought I'm pretty bold to try and teach it in one session. So we're going to talk a little bit about women's roles. I'm going to share with you a couple different sides. One side will be probably the most conservative side. The other side, I'm going to share with you the most liberal side on it. So, and I tend to find myself somewhere in the middle between these two sides, but I think you ought to know both sides. And so I'll spend a little bit more on the side that says that there's not really a role difference between male and female, that females can do anything that they want, including preach or be an elder. The reason I'm going to spend a little bit more time on that is we know the other one well. And so I want you to know where these people that believe that are coming from. And one of the things about the women's row, in my opinion, is it's not a salvation issue. I don't believe that your view on what women can or can't do in church is going to keep you from heaven if you've put your faith and trust in Jesus Christ as your Savior. I just don't get that. And I think that in the series that I've been preaching called The Measure of a Church, where we've talked about the things that we have said distinctively make the church growing up in this particular fellowship, being the churches of Christ, that we've talked about how those things sometimes haven't been salvation issues. Now, we would argue that baptism is, but when you get away from baptism, most of the other things are really not that connected to the salvation process that we've said are distinctive, identifying forms of the church. And so I think that women's issue is one of those things. Now, what makes this difficult is it's an emotional topic. This will rile some people up to the point that some people can't even think about this without getting emotional and closed-minded and shutting down someone that's saying anything except what they've always heard. I used to be one of those people. It just made me nervous because I could show you a verse, and we're going to look at them right now, that said that women should be silent in the church, and anybody that said anything different, I immediately didn't listen to them because they were ignoring that verse. And that's how adamant I was about it. Now, never mind, there were some other verses that showed women prophesying and different things. You know, well, I'll figure out a way to explain those, but I was going to hang my hat on that one. So we're going to try and look at both sides. I will say that Jesus was on the forefront of expanding the role of women in the Gospels. I know that Rob McCrae spent a lot of time when he preached through Luke. Luke is one of the Gospels that really spends a lot of time showing how women were more involved. In Luke chapter 8, verses 2-3, you have a number of women that are following Jesus, and these are women that he healed. It says he had healed some women, and they just devoted their lives to him and followed to him. In Matthew 27, verses 55-56, you find all these women. It said there were a group of women that followed Jesus and ministered to him, took care of some of his needs. So we won't go into a lot more about that. So why study this? Well, I think one good reason to study it is we live in a culture that makes no distinction between male and female. In fact, you can pretty much choose your gender. They've invented a new word or gave it a new definition, and now gender is culturally used to be whatever you want to be. And I don't think the Bible goes that far. I think that is a misunderstanding of human nature and a misunderstanding of how God created us. But on the other hand, I think that we have had restrictions, or at least I've been a part of restrictions that aren't biblical in regard to the role of women, because people have been so nervous about overstepping and giving women authority. And I think that we have been overly restrictive and inconsistent, because we have given women authority, but we sort of find ways to do it and say it's okay. And so we're going to talk about all that. And so why is it important? Because we don't want to put restrictions where the Bible doesn't put restrictions. So let's look quickly. I have some verses, so everybody get your Bibles out. I'm going to need some readers today. So Luke, let's see, I went over that one already. 1 Timothy 2, verse 12. Bill? 1 Timothy 3, 8 through 12. Brian? 1 Corinthians 14, 33 through 35. Mark's got that one. 1 Corinthians 11, 3 through 5. Philip? Acts 18, 24 through 28. Lori? Acts 21, 8 through 9. Jeff? Luke 2, 36 through 39. Lane? Romans 16, 1 through 2. Anybody want to get that one? Keith? And I think, I got two more. 1 Peter 5, 1 through 3. I'm going to have everybody in here reading. Wes? Ephesians 5, 25. Last one. Ephesians 5, 25. Thank you, Terry. Okay, so this is the one that we're most familiar with, and this is going to be a view of strong male authority with not a lot of room to use females in the work of the church. And we'll start with 1 Timothy 2 and verse 12.
I do not permit a woman to teach or have authority over a man. She must be silent.
Okay, so this is a verse that we're very familiar with, and it's our go-to verse. And then I think I'm going to skip and go to 1 Corinthians 14, 33 through 35, and we'll come back to 1 Timothy 3:8. So 1 Corinthians 14, 33 through 35.
For God is not a God of disorder, but of peace. As in all the congregations of the saints, women should remain silent in the churches. They are not allowed to speak, but must be in submission, as the law says.
Okay, so pretty cut and dry. Women can't teach or have authority over a man. And in the church, women should be silent, as the law says. And so in this view, those passages are the norm. And I want you to understand this. These are the norm. These are the way it's supposed to be. So anything that's different than those two passages needs to be explained or understood, because it can't contradict those two passages. And so you have a little bit of a problem when you get to 1 Corinthians chapter 11, because in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 3 through 5, this is going on. Who has that one? 1 Corinthians 11, 3 through 5. Did I give that one?
Sorry.
That's okay.
We were debating something.
All right. Hey, you're not supposed to be talking to him. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
There is one thing I want you to know. The head of every man is Christ. The head of every woman is man. And the head of Christ is God. A man dishonors his head if he covers his head while praying or prophesying. But a woman dishonors her head if she prays or prophesies without a covering on her head. For this is the same as shaving her head.
Okay, so this passage becomes a little bit difficult for the view that women have to be silent and can't teach or have authority over men. But if you decide that a woman cannot teach or have authority over a man and that she has to be silent in church, then what you have to do with this verse is decide there's only one of two options, because they're prophesying and praying in this passage. And so what you decide is the silence is the normative, and that's God's law and what he wants. And here where they're praying and prophesying, there's only two possibilities. One of those possibilities is that it's just women talking to women. Now, then you have to ask, why do they have to wear a veil? And then if you're really sharp, you go, well, because of angels. Because it says they have to wear a veil to be in submission to their husband, and because of angels. Well, what does that mean? Well, I don't know, but it says it here. And that's kind of the argument you have to make, is it's just women and women, which means that the women get together and they had to wear veils while they were just prophesying with each other, but it can't be in the church because we already know that they were told to be silent in the church. The other possibility is you can make a distinction, and many people that I grew up with did this, between 1 Corinthians 11 and they're praying and prophesying at home versus the church. And many times, my upbringing, people took me to 11:17 where it says, but in the following instructions, I do not commend you, because when you come together, it's not for the better, but for the worse. And they go, see, now here's where church starts. In verse 17, they come together. And so what happened, because they had to be together, they were wearing veils, but that was in a home, and that was in an informal setting, and this is the church. Now, there's a little bit of a problem with that. Y'all quickly see what the problem is? Is church was in home back then, But in our mind, we have no problem separating those two out. But this is the difficulty for this view, is explaining 1 Corinthians 11. It's a very difficult passage to explain. But this view is that women have to remain silent in the church and they can't talk. One more point on this view, and we'll move to the next one, and it's 1 Timothy 3, 8 through 12.
Deacons likewise must be men of dignity, not double-tongued or addicted to much wine or fond of sordid gain, but holding the mystery of the faith with a clear conscience. These men must also be first tested, then let them serve as deacons if they are beyond reproach. Women must likewise be dignified and not malicious gossips, but temperate, faithful in all things.
Okay, so this passage says that men should be appointed as deacons, and that they should have wives that that are godly. And so that this particular passage, and I'm gonna, what version did you read out of, just out of curiosity?
The New American Standard.
Okay. So in mine it says, so their wives likewise must be dignified and not slanderers. His said women, but what we interpret this as normally in the Church of Christ, and the versions that we've used are wives. That's why I asked him what version he used. And so we say, here's deacons, and the wives, their wives need to be godly as well. And that's the way we interpret this passage. So they can't be preachers, elders, deacons. They can't talk in the church. They have to remain under authority. Any questions about that view? I'm going to move on to the next one. Is there something major I left out I need to cover in that view? So I said in this view, they can't be elders or preachers. They can't speak in the church. They can't have authority. They can't be deacons in this view. Okay. Now, this is the other view. This is not my view, just so you know, although there's parts of this view that I ascribe to, but not in full. But I have good friends that love the Lord that believe in this view. I suspect that this was Rob McCrae's view, who came here and was kind enough to push a little bit, not share his full view. Okay, and there's a lot of people in our fellowship that have this view right now. It's not my view. I'm a little bit in the middle, like I've said, but this is a view that some scholarly people that study the Bible and want to do what's right have. So let's read 1 Corinthians 11 again, verses 3 through 5. Who had that? Can you read it again for me?
Yes.
Okay.
But there is one thing I want you to know. The head of every man is Christ. The head of every woman is man. And the head of Christ is God. A man dishonors his head if he covers his head while praying or prophesying. But a woman dishonors her head if she prays or prophesies without a covering on her head. For it is the same as shaving her head.
Okay. So in this view, and I'm going to give you a lot of other passages. It says, look, it's obvious that women were praying and prophesying. They had to wear veils, so there must have been men present. And if you're praying and prophesying with men present, that's church. There's nowhere in the Bible, and I've already made this argument, that distinguishes between home groups and church groups. This is an argument that we've made in modern times because we built church buildings. Churches were in homes during this time. There weren't other places for them to meet. And so these were men and women prophesying and praying, and the reason they had to wear the veil is men were present, and we're going to find other passages. I'm about to read them where women were more involved than we thought they were. And so if this is the case, then we need to understand what the context is of wearing the veil and what the context is of not having authority and the context of being quiet in the church. So what happened, here's the difference, is they say this is normative. Women were praying and prophesying, but they were supposed to do it with a sign of authority and respect for the culture. And so where it says they can't be silent in church, now we all know they talk in church, they sing, they do all sorts of things. So what does that really mean? And so they go over to that passage to try and understand the context. We're going to look at it in a little bit. And then the 1 Timothy 2 passage is the one that they have the most difficulty with in this view, because it's pretty clear. It says that a woman shouldn't teach or have authority over men. It ties it into creation. We'll get to that one a little bit later. But not only do they say this is the norm, so the other passages are more culturally bound, but if you read down here in read with me verse 5 and following. For a wife will not cover her head, then she should cut her hair short. For if a wife will not cover her head, then she should cut her hair short. But since it's disgraceful for a wife to cut off her hair or shave her head, let her cover her head. For a man not ought to cover his head, since he is in the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of men. Now, I'm going to stop right there. This is a very culturally bound argument and here's what he says. Well, if you're not going to wear a veil, shave your head, women, is what he says. Because I know you're not going to shave your head. Which goes to prove that my point, well, that's a cultural point. I'm not sure that one is a creation point, not right now, okay? And then he says, men, and the same thing. You need to wear short hair, don't wear long hair. Well, most of you in here went through the long hair stage, that happened in the 70s, and some of you probably had the long hair. I know Dick did. He's confessed it several times. Now, but then he goes on and says, for man was not made from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman from man. So it looks like he's tying it to creation, but listen very carefully to 10 and 11. That is why a wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. That's the one that doesn't make sense. But look at 11. Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor man of woman. For as woman was made from man, so man is now born of woman, and all things are from God. Now, that's an interesting comment. So, by the way, man was made first, and woman was made from man, and unless you're going to shave your head, you need to wear the sign of authority. However, in the Lord, man and woman are not independent from each other, because we may have argued earlier that woman was made from man, but now there's no man without woman. Man comes from woman now. So he sort of reverses his argument. And by the way, Paul does this multiple places. You know where else he does it? On food sacrificed to idols. He'll say, now listen, there's no idol, eat whatever you want. Hey, if your brother's worried about it, then don't eat meat sacrificed to idol. Because if you think it's wrong, but we all know there's nothing wrong with it. Paul, he does this double speak. Don't tell me that the Bible is always simple and easy to understand. Some of it is very complicated. And this is one of those areas, because it makes no sense that some of this, but he then says they're not independent. So he says they're sort of equal in the Lord. They're dependent on each other. So listen to Galatians 3:28. This is another view another verse they go to. Who had Galatians 3:28?
I don't think you assigned this set yet.
Oh, did I not? Okay. Galatians 3:28. I may not have signed that one. So I'll just go over there.
I got it right here.
Okay, read it for us, Dick.
There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free man, there is neither male nor female, for you all for you are all one in Jesus Christ.
Okay, so in this verse, and this is a verse they go to, it says that there isn't a differentiation between male or female, or Jew or Greek, or slave or master. Now, I don't think he's making an argument for the cultural gender thing. That's not what he's saying here. But what he's saying is that we're all the same in the Lord. And so one of the interesting things there is slave and master. Paul gives all these instructions for slaves to obey and be respectful to their master, but he says in the Lord, you're the same. And they would argue he gives all these instructions for women to be submissive to their husband and do what they say to do, but in the Lord, they're the same. So that would be some of the arguments that would be made on this. Now, let's read a few of these verses now. Acts 18, 24 through 28.
Meanwhile, a Jew named Apollos, a native of Alexandria, came to Ephesus. He was a learned man with a thorough knowledge of the Scriptures. He had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and he spoke with great fervor and taught about Jesus accurately, though he knew only the baptism of John. He began to speak boldly in the synagogue. When Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they invited him to their home and explained to him the way of God more adequately. When Apollos wanted to go to Achaia, the brothers encouraged him and wrote to the disciples there to welcome him. On arriving, he was a great help to those who by grace had believed, for he vigorously refuted the Jews in public debate, proving from the Scriptures that Jesus was the Christ.
Okay, so we're very familiar with this. Priscilla and Aquila, husband and wife, took Apollos aside and taught him. And so, by the way, based on this passage at this church, we've allowed male and female to co-teach in a class based on this passage. And so that there's an example of a woman involved in the teaching, and she's teaching a man. All right, so next passage is Acts 21, 8 through 9.
The next day we left and came to Caesarea. We went into the house of Philip the evangelist, one of the 7, and stayed with him. He had 4 unmarried daughters who had the gift of prophecy.
Now, it was a long time in my life growing up in the church for I knew Philip had 4 daughters that prophesied. For some reason, no one had ever shown that verse to me. And so, you know, I guess you could argue they only prophesied to women, or they didn't do it in a church setting, you know, but this view would say, look, here's 4 prophetesses. And so women are a lot more active than you think. Luke 2, 36 through 39.
There was also a prophetess, Anna, the daughter of Phanuel, of the tribe of Asher. She was very old. She had lived with her husband 7 years after her marriage, and then was a widow until she was 84. She never left the temple, but worshiped night and day, fasting and praying. Coming up to them at that very moment, she gave thanks to God and spoke about the child to all who were looking forward to the redemption of Jerusalem. When Joseph and Mary had done everything required by the law of the Lord, they returned to Galilee to their own town of Nazareth.
So here we have a lady, Anna, who's a prophetess, who's in the temple prophesying. And now that will blow your mind a little bit, especially knowing Jewish culture. So here's an exception even under the conservative Jewish religion where you have a woman prophesying in the temple. And so the argument that would be made on this view is, look, you have women prophesying and praying in 1 Corinthians 11. You have the daughters of Philip that were prophesying. And this is in a very male-dominated society for the most part, especially a male-dominated Jewish religion. And then you also even have the example here of a lady prophesying in the temple. And then in addition, you have Priscilla and Aquila teaching the men. So that is allowable. The question is why in some places does the Bible show women prophesying and praying? In other places, they're told to be quiet. Well, the argument would be made that the same reason that slaves are told to obey the masters, women are told to be more submissive even than they need to be because of culture. And that would be one of the arguments. Now, in Romans 16, did I give that one to anybody? Trying to decide if I want to get, I'll go ahead and read that. It's probably not out of order a little bit, but let's read Romans 16. What did I say, 1 through 2 or something?
I commend to you our sister Phoebe, the servant of the church at Caesarea, that you may welcome her in the Lord in a way worthy of the saints, and help her in whatever she may need from you, for she has been a patron of many and of myself as well.
Okay. Does anybody have a version that says deaconess? Romans 16, 1 through 2. What version are you reading, Jeff?
Greek.
Yeah, okay, that's good enough. In the Greek, it says deaconess because the word servant is diakonos in Greek. And so oftentimes, I should have known better than that. I know he reads his Greek Bible. I worry about it. When I get up there, I worry about if I'm going to say a Greek word wrong, that Jeff's going to know I said it wrong. Nobody else will, but Jeff will. So really, for most of my growing up, when I read that, it said Phoebe was a deaconess when I read that. And so that now people would say, well, that just means a servant. Well, why do we translate it deacon in so many other places? And by the way, most people think that Paul sent the letter to the Romans with Phoebe because he says, accept her, I'm commending her. She's a deaconess in the Lord, and she probably is the one that took the letter. So the women were a lot more involved. And by the way, in Romans 16, you start reading all these people that probably met in homes, and there's about 26, 27 names. 9 of them are women that Paul singles out, which means they were probably leaders in the church. I guess you could argue they only led women. But y'all, from what I see about the women that lead around here, we do a lot of what they tell us to do. So I'm just saying. Now, so that is part of the argument. So let's go to 1 Corinthians 14 now and deal with the passage where they're told to remain silent, since that is one of the big ones. So 1 Corinthians 14, 33 through 35, as in all the churches of the saints, the women should keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but should be in submission as the law says. If there's anything they desire to learn, let them ask their husbands at home, for it's shameful for a woman to speak in church. So here's the first question the people that have this view would ask. Well, where does the law say that women can't speak in church? Does anybody know where that is in the Old Testament? Well, probably because it's not there. Okay, now, it does say they should be in submission. There are some passages that say a wife should be submissive to her husband. It may be talking about that, but there is not anything in the Bible, in the Old Testament, that says that women should be quiet in church. That's just not there. Now, also, we know that they can talk in church. You know, I had Jean stand up when we recognized mothers, and she said, thank you. During church, you know. Well, I don't think anything thought about that. Why? Because she wasn't, you know, leading for one or taking authority. It was just a response. I know that we've had before Rich and Lisa Bowling get up and talk about CR. So we've done some things that have allowed women to speak. We've shown videos. We've done dramas. So we have not taken seriously that women should not ever say a word in church. I mean, if you took that real seriously, they couldn't sing. And so what does that mean? Well, it says here that if first in verse 33, it says God's not a God of confusion, but a God of peace. So apparently there was some disruption going on during the service. Secondly, it says below that, that a woman should be silent in church and she needs to ask her husband questions at home. It sounds like, and this is what these people believe, that there was a disturbance and women were challenging their husbands. And he says, look, you shouldn't do that. You're supposed to be in submission to your husband, is what he's talking about here. Ask your husband these things at home. There shouldn't be some sort of husband-wife dispute over the Bible in the middle of worship. Y'all shouldn't be doing this, so y'all work this out at home. A wife needs to have a spirit of submission toward her husband. So that's what they take this passage to mean. And then they would go to 14:26 where it says, what then, brothers, when you come together, each one has a hymn, a lesson, a revelation, a tongue, or an interpretation. Let all these be done for the building up. And so they would argue everyone. It doesn't say when you come together, some of the men have some things to share. No, it says, everyone comes together and has something to contribute. So they would argue that you have something to contribute. Now, so we already read 16, 1 through 2. Let's go back to 1 Timothy 2. Well, let's see. Yeah, let's go back to 1 Timothy 2 for a second. So I think 1 Timothy 2 is the one that's probably the most difficult for this view to deal with, because it just says that a woman should not teach or have authority over a man. And it's what happens when I switch Bibles and I don't have everything underlined anymore. Okay. Verse 12, I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over men, rather she's to remain quiet. And then he says, for Adam was formed first, then Eve. Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived, became a transgressor. So the argument that they would make, I think this is the one that they have the toughest time explaining and have the weakest argument, but the argument they would make is this is very similar to that 1 Corinthians 11 passage, and it's cultural. But what he didn't add in 1 Timothy that he added over in 1 Corinthians 11, which we need to keep in mind, is woman and man are not independent from each other. And even though woman came first, remember that now man comes from woman. That's what their argument would be on this. Now, when it comes to deacons, I already had us read Romans 16, 1 through 2, where it says that Phoebe was a deaconess. And so when you go to 1 Timothy chapter 3, and you look at the rows of deacons, they would say this is qualifications for deacons and deaconess. So turn to 1 Timothy 3, verse 8, and I'm going to read it to you. So deacons likewise must be dignified, not double-tongued, not addicted to much wine, not greedy for dishonest gain. They must hold the mystery of the faith with a clear conscience, and let them also be tested first. Then let them serve as deacons if they prove themselves blameless. And then verse 11, I have the English Standard Version, so it says their wives likewise, but actually in the Greek it says women likewise. That could be translated as wives, but it could be translated as just women. Women likewise must be dignified. So man, here's their qualifications. Women, much like the man, but also not slanderers, sober-minded, faithful in all things. And let all the servants each be the husband of one, let the deacons each be the husband of one wife. It goes, well, why then didn't tell that women should just be the wife of one husband? Because there was no such thing as women marrying multiple men back then. That was a male issue. And a lot of men would be polygamous and be married to more than one wife. We saw that back in the Old Testament, right? David had multiple wives. Solomon had multiple wives. And so this is something, men, here's your qualifications. Women likewise, and here's some qualifications for women. And men, one more thing for you, you should only be the husband of one wife. And that's the way, and that is, by the way, a very credible way to translate that passage. And to say that that passage is only qualifications for women, for men, and that women can't be deacons, you have to go to these other scriptures to make that point. Well, why? Because it says that they can't teach or have authority, and it says that they have to be silent in church. So we know that's what it says, but you can't get it from the Greek text by itself. It could be translated either way. Okay, questions about that? Did y'all follow that? Okay. So, all right. So I gave you both views. Anybody have a question about one of those views before I summarize all this? Okay. So, some of my thoughts. First of all, I think that we need to remember that Jesus in his ministry redefines what authority is. So let's start with Ephesians 5, verse 25.
I got it.
All right, Terry.
It's a good one, too. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for her.
I like the way he did that with authority. So I will tell you, I'm just, Paul argues from nature. I'm going to argue from nature for a second. Some of the worst marriages I've seen have been the ones where the husband says, well, she won't just sit down when I tell her to and be quiet when I tell her to or do what I tell her to do. And that's a bad marriage. We already know it, don't we? Well, she's not submissive enough. And so that just reminds me, Monica and I started, I hate to tell any movie these days I'm watching. I'm afraid there'll be something bad in it and it'll come back to haunt me. But we've been watching Bob Loves Abishola, and it's just hilarious. And this guy dates this Nigerian woman, and he's big and great personality, but this Nigerian comes along who's really good looking and Nigerian, and everybody wants her to go for him. And he sits her down, and he is a charmer, and he says, look, I just want you to know that you can keep your job. If we get married, you can keep your job. The only thing I expect is that dinner is on the table when I get home. If that's the case, no problem. And she said, we have a problem. We got a problem. And I think that sort of antiquated mentality, and I'm not saying that doesn't mean that for some of you women, that was your road to get the dinner on the table. That's okay. But I don't think the Bible says you have to do that. If you're both working, it's different, right? In fact, one of the biggest things I found in years of counseling is one of the things that marriages fight over more than anything else is who does what. Because it has to be fair. One person can't carry a bigger load than someone else. That's not fair, and it will create resentment. And so, a woman that stays home can do more around the house and do more things than a woman that works. So you have to kind of make things fair. Where I've seen problems is both men and women work, and the man comes home and sits on the sofa when he gets home and does nothing, drinks his beer and watches TV. None of you all would do that, I'm sure, but I heard a few laughs. But and the wife has to go do everything. Well, that's a problem. That's not fair. And that is a misuse of this passage. And so I think that we need to understand that this passage says that the male does what Christ did. He actually sacrificed himself for the church, which means that a good husband will do anything to help his wife. And now I will say, I think men and women are made different. I've always said I don't understand. It seems like the plumbing's pretty obvious to me, but anyhow. So I think that our brains are different, though, and men's brains get washed in testosterone at some point in time in the birth process. It makes them different. They're actually wired differently. And so, to say that we all are the same is just crazy. So when we decorate our house, I get a say, but Monica gets more say. There's some things we do in our house that I'm better at. I get more say. Now, you want to really kind of get crazy with this, though. Sometimes these are general things. There's generally things that men are better than women, but then to really freak our minds out, sometimes it's role reversal. And you have a man that's really good with art decorations and the woman isn't. So it's hard to figure all this out. But generally speaking, men and women are created differently. And generally speaking, we know what some of those strengths and weaknesses are. Men, generally speaking, aren't as nurturing as women are. We know that. Now, there's exceptions. So I think that we need to understand that marriage is a partnership, and I think that church is very much a partnership in more ways than sometimes we want to admit. Now, the people that say that everything's equal, I'm running out of time now. I guess I could finish it next week, couldn't I? But when they take that Christ is the head of the church, and the husband is the head of the wife, they translate the word head as source, like the head of a river. And I've read all those arguments on that. I don't buy those, just to be honest with you. In fact, they spend a whole lot more time studying how the Greek word kephalos for head is used in Greek culture and in other writings than they do the Bible. So the Bible tends to use it more as authority. So I do believe, this is just my view where I stand. I can see how other people believe what they do. I do believe that for some reason the Bible has placed a male authority structure over the church and to me, it's male elders and male preachers. And outside of that, since I think women could be deacons, women could do a whole lot of things under the authority of the elders, in my opinion. And the truth is, we've done a lot of that here. I've sat and Celebrate Recovery and watched women lead. I have been in here and heard women speak. And I haven't gotten to be in a class and hear co-teaching because it seems like I was teaching a class. But some of you have been here and had male and female co-teaching a class. And so I believe that there's a lot more women can do. And I think the question is, just what can be done under authority? Well, in my view, a woman could give a testimony. A woman, I certainly think that if we went back to passing communion, in those early churches in the homes, do you think the men got up and served the bread and the wine? The women had to have been the ones that got up and brought it and served it. We've made that somehow a leadership thing and you stand up. We don't do it anymore. I hope we don't go back to it. But you stand up here and you have this role of man and you can't put a woman up there because that'd be subverting authority. Well, that just makes no sense at all. And let's be really clear that if there is some sort of authority here, it's over teaching. That's really what it's over, is teaching. And so outside of teaching, there is great latitude. I can't tell you how many times women run ministries in churches. They run the funeral ministry and we do what they say. Put that table there and put those chairs there and go to the store and get this. And that's authority. And so it's not about authority over anything. The authority that, if you're going to argue that they don't have, is teaching authority over the church. And to me, under the authority of an elder, a woman can get up and even share something that she has expertise over, that the elders gave them the right to share. Now, having said all that, I'm not pushing for change in all those areas. I don't want to give up the changes that we've had. But I think that it's important that we look carefully at the Bible and that we understand that there are two views here. There are two different views here, and it's not a salvation issue. So I also, and I've been saying this all along, is you have to maintain unity in the body. And so it's a really delicate thing to maintain unity in the body because there's two ways to do it. One way is just to, when you're going to make change, you can do anything you think the Bible tells you to do. Well, you may end up without a church if you do that because people have traditions. And that's not a good idea. I know churches that split over instrumental music just because the elders decided it was okay. They forced it through. Half the church left. A lot of them didn't leave because they thought it was wrong. Some of them just left because of the way it was done. I know other groups, and this is the other danger, that 2 or 3 people are against something and they won't do anything unless everybody's in favor. Well, then you won't ever change anything because there's always going to be 2 or 3 people that are opposed to everything. And so finding that balance is something that is a real challenge for churches and a challenge for elders as they try and be faithful to the Word of God. And it's a challenge for a church, because we don't always get our way. But the important thing is we continue to put our faith in Jesus Christ and that we seek unity and that we allow some diversity of opinions in areas where the Bible is not clear. Last thing, what the Bible does not say is this. It doesn't say, we know that women that women can only speak in homes and they can't speak in churches, and it doesn't make that distinction between church and home. I think that's one of the things that we've added. It just doesn't do that. Okay, we're out of time. I will come back to this next week. If any of you have questions, we can start with some questions, and then I'm going to summarize this whole series next week.
A few years ago, one older here, he's been gone some time now. He said, you can serve communion. I had never heard that in my life. I said, no, I can't. He said, yes, you can, but I can't, so I didn't.
Well, I'm glad you didn't do what you can't.
I just wouldn't have felt right.
Yeah. Well, and so we all have different comforts based on how we were raised and what we've done, what we've been taught, and that's why we have to be sensitive to each other as well and bring people along in the Lord. Thanks for sharing that, Gene. God bless you all. See you at worship.